I'm really delighted to introduce Professor Michele Burman, who is the current president of the European Society of Criminology. She is a major figure in criminology in Scotland, in the UK and internationally, and she's a former colleague of mine from early years, which I think you will share some stories about later in the interview. So Michele, welcome. So let's begin at the beginning. Tell me about your academic career. How did you become a criminologist? How did you actually get into criminology?
Right, thanks Lesley. I think in order to tell the story of how I became a criminologist, I have to go back to when I was a teenager. Because although I was born in London, I went when I was a teenager to go and live in Africa, in South Africa, during the apartheid years. Mm-hmm. My father was working in Africa and the whole family went over. I did my last couple of years at school there, and then I went to the University of Cape Town, UCT, and there I studied sociology and psychology, and then on to clinical psychology. And it was a time of turmoil. There was a lot of student protests. Steve Biko had recently been killed. In my last year of school, there was the Soweto riots. It was a highly politicized time. My interest in these issues was sparked through the degree that I did in sociology. Mm-hmm. And during that time, I was involved myself in a lot of student protests and activities around the anti-apartheid movement. As part of my clinical psychology degree, I had an internship at a place called Valkenburg Hospital, which is a really interesting place in Cape Town. It's a mental institution, but it started off life as a leper colony, and then it was a prison, and then it became a mental institution. And whilst I was doing my internship there, I became interested in the work of the forensic unit there that was working with mentally disordered offenders and also those that were considered to be unable to stand trial due to insanity. So that I became quite interested in around the treatment of these people and the fact that they were located in this asylum, which was a dreadful institution in so many ways. So that really interested me in ideas around justice and how justice could be provided and what it meant in those kinds of, in that context, in that apartheid context, in a mental institution at that particular time of political turmoil. So whilst I was a student at UCT, and actually after I was a student, I became involved in rape crisis movement in Cape Town, and I became a volunteer at the local rape crisis centre. The context in South Africa in relation to violence against women is stark. I mean, at the time and still now, there are extremely high rates of rape, interpersonal violence, and domestic abuse. And the number of women who have been affected by that is vast in that country. And so this was a real the first kind of my first foray into activism, I think, as a feminist activist, was through my association with rape crisis at that particular time. And in fact, that has actually shaped my whole career. That abiding interest that I've got in securing justice for women and girls who've been victims of male violence predominantly. But it all started as a student at the UCT and involving in the rape crisis movement. Yeah.
And then you left South Africa. Tell me a bit about that journey.
I did. I left South Africa. I graduated. I worked for a while. In fact, I went back to Valkenburg to work as a clinical psychologist. I was hopeless at it, absolutely hopeless. I was too young, and I couldn't find the skills in myself to be able to act as a psychologist in that context of apartheid, because most of the people, their illnesses were inextricably linked to the context in which they were living, and it was a very difficult thing. And I was just too young to be able to engage at that level. So I did lots of different things. none of them anything to do with criminology or academia or clinical psychology for some years. I did leave South Africa, and I've never returned to live, although I do go back to see family there and friends. And I left by road and travelled through the length of Africa from Cape Town, which took a long time, which was an extraordinary experience in so many ways. And eventually washed up in London, which is where I'm from. And I worked in London, had a variety of different odd jobs. In fact, well, I did end up at one time working for a merchant bank, for two merchant banks, where I worked in corporate finance in merger and acquisitions, which was again an extraordinary experience. It hasn't really stood me in any good stead for being a criminologist, but it was an interesting side venture. But I always wanted to return to university, and it wasn't until my late 20s that I decided to go back to university, and I went to Edinburgh University to study an MSc, a postgraduate master's, in criminology and criminal justice, which I absolutely loved. I relished my time at Edinburgh University. I had a wonderful group of friends, many of whom are criminologists, many of whom are here from those days, and we had some inspirational teachers.
Yeah.
Peter Young, David Garland, Neil McCormack, Beverly Brown. It was a really exciting time to be a student at Edinburgh University then. And so that's really kind of where I got involved in criminology, and I kind of shared my clinical psychology background, I think, and became much more involved in criminology. And I was very lucky when I graduated. I had no money, didn't know what I was going to do. Was I going to go back to London? And one of my thesis dissertation supervisor said to me, "Do you want a job?" And it was those days where those kinds of things happened. I was very, very fortunate, and there was a job that was going to be available in something called the Criminological Research Branch, which I know you know very well, Lesley, in the Scottish Government, which was known as the Scottish Office then. It was before the days of devolution. And in fact, and again, this cannot happen, is that my dissertation supervisor came with me for the job interview.
That was Peter Young.
It was Peter Young. Came in with me for the job interview, and I was interviewed by Jacqueline Toombs, Dr. Jackie Toombs, who was the head of the Criminological Research Branch within the Scottish Government for many, many years, and a very well-known and formidable character. The initial job was for 3 months, I think, and I was working on a large prosecutorial decision-making study, and then I moved on to a study on appeals and decision-making in appeals, which gave me a real insight into criminal justice workings in Scotland, you know, on the prosecution side, and then on the post-sentencing appeal side. And it involved a lot of scrabbling around in the basement of the big High Court in Edinburgh, looking through boxes of dusty files and gathering materials for the research. And my contract was extended, you know, sort of 3 months by 3 months. And then I applied for a research project, a large research project that was the two PIs were two women at Edinburgh University, one of whom was one of my lecturers previously in the law school there, and where criminology was taught, and the other was somebody in sociology, Lynn Jameson. So it's Beverly Brown and Lynn Jameson, and we worked on that project together for 3 years, which was a large project looking at an evaluation of recently introduced rape shield legislation, which introduced some prohibitions on the introduction of sexual history and, at that point, sexual character evidence in rape trials. And that was a large project that involved me attending trials. I think through that project I ended up attending 220 rape trials up and down the country over a period of 3 years, interviewing those that were who were the victims of the trials, interviewing judges which was a lot of fun, and interviewing defence advocates and prosecutors, and during that time I actually felt that I wanted to do a PhD myself, and of course, because I was a member of staff at the University of Edinburgh, then there was no other place that I was going to study other than back at Edinburgh University, so I embarked on a PhD there, which was very much focused on the experiences of young women and characterisations of young women that have been subjected to sexual offences, and my particular focus was about their representations and portrayals in sexual offence trials. So it kind of had lots of links with the research project that I was studying, but it was quite distinctive that it was looking at young women aged between 16 and 21. So after that, I went, I think, to Aberdeen University as a researcher. I was a contract researcher for probably 11 years in total, and I think that's one of the concerns that I have about our young early career researchers, is that they're very much on precarious contracts. I know what that was like. Feeling that are you going to have enough money to pay your rent? Where's your next contract coming from? Moving from contract to contract, not having enough time in between to write up findings and create publications and enhance your CV from the work that you've done on one project, because you have to move on to another. So it's a very invidious system, and I think it's very common through criminology. But anyway, I went to Edinburgh, to Aberdeen University, and I worked on another large project. I was very fortunate. These were in the days that projects were long. Now, you're lucky if you get a 12-month project. In those days, these were 4-year projects. And this project in Aberdeen, I worked with a woman called Siobhan Lloyd, this was a project, it was in the early 90s, in Scotland, where Scotland had just introduced specialised units for the investigation of crimes of violence against women and children. And these were seen as a huge innovation. And the research project that we had was to evaluate the operation of these specialist units located within police stations, but often as a kind of an annex. So, the great pains were taken to ensure that there were separate entrances and they didn't look like police stations at all. And a lot of these were in setting up of these police specialist units were not only in Scotland but also in England, and many of them had been sparked because there was a ghastly documentary, a fly-on-the-wall documentary taken in Thames Valley Police about the police investigation of somebody who came in to allege that they had been raped. And it was just a hostile environment for that person, interrogatory questioning, accusations of false allegations. So these police specialist units were set up. And I was very lucky to be able to do the first evaluation of those, of the one in Scotland. Yes. Thereafter, I was stayed in Aberdeen, still as a contract researcher, and I went to work on something different. I went to work on a diversionary project with Professor Pete Duff in the law school. He was a professor of criminal justice there for many, many years, and we looked at the way in which diversionary from prosecution was happening, and the way in which accused persons were offered the opportunity to be diverted out of the system with the say-so of the prosecutor, and diverted into a range of different areas, some into treatment programs, some under social work supervision, which was again a really interesting project. And I could reflect on that through the earlier project that I'd done with Jackie Toombs on prosecution in the public interest.
That's great. So what happened after that? So you moved in Aberdeen and then...
Yes, well, I did go back to the Scottish Government for about another year in between, actually, and where I was lucky to meet you.
We met.
And also Professor Susan McVie, where the three of us worked Quite closely. You were more in civil justice.
I was in social work.
Social work, and I was, Susan and I were in criminological. I'd been promoted by then. I was a senior research officer.
Yes, we were junior.
Yeah, at that point, and that was extraordinary. And it was at a time where there was funding around for external research. I mean, you know, as we know, we've gone through famine and feast in terms of available funding around to provide government funding to provide external research. And I was fortunate to be there at a time when there was a lot of money around, and I was a research manager that was overseeing and reviewing research applications. It was a hugely important and informative period about, you know, the way in which research applications were made and written. And I also had the wonderful opportunity to meet many criminologists there, including the redoubtable Professor Jason Ditton at the time, on his large projects around CCTV and the ecstasy use in Ibiza at the time. So some wonderfully interesting people and criminologists and wonderfully interesting research projects. And then after that I went to Glasgow University. I actually became a lecturer in the sociology of deviance there at the time when there were such positions called the sociology of deviance. And I've been at Glasgow University ever since, actually. It's almost 30 years.
Wow.
That I've been at Glasgow University now, so
I think it's probably longer, because I was 30 years at Edinburgh, and that was after you started Glasgow.
Oh, maybe it is. Maybe I've dropped a few years along the way.
Also, I should just say the Central Research Unit has resulted in 2 presidents of the European Society of Criminology.
I know.
So that's actually a great legacy.
It's a great legacy.
Anyway, you've already sort of touched on some of your sort of, you know, the interest that really drove you into criminology. And actually, they, as you say, have shaped your career ever since. But I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about your particular interests, and particularly around feminist criminology. Could you tell viewers something about that? Yes.
So whilst I was a student I've always been interested in feminist ideas, you know, from my early days at the University of Cape Town. When I went to Edinburgh University to study as a master's degree, I was very fortunate to be taught by Beverly Brown, Professor Beverly Brown. And it was there, through her classes, that I really became interested in some of the feminist debates that were going on and the clash between feminism and criminology at that time. The idea that actually these were 2 incompatible disciplines, that feminist concepts and ideas, epistemologies, methodologies were anathema to criminology, and there was no way in which that they could be aligned. And there was a lot of work at that time. Frances Hydenson was writing about this. Carol Smart in the UK were writing about the sort of the struggle between feminism and criminology, because criminology had, up until that point, had been very much focused on research in relation to male experiences and so on, and largely ignoring gender altogether, actually, even though it was the most prominent feature. But and so I became very interested in the ideas of feminism, and the ways in which feminism brought ideas from outside criminology. Ideas around theories, around methods, and around epistemologies coming in to do that. And it was an exciting time because there was a proliferation of feminist work at that time around not only in relation to violence against women and girls, which was my particular interest, but also in relation to women as offenders within the criminal justice system, the punishment of women. And that's an area that I've become much more interested in as my career has gone on, because the parallels there between women as victims and women as offenders are almost, they're invisible,
And you also say, I was asking you before the interview, we were prepping for this, and asking you to list what your research interests were. You said the meaning and pursuit of justice and what it means for women subjected to crimes of violence. I thought that was a really important theme. So do you want to just reflect a little bit more on that?
Yes. Well, I think I realised pretty early on that substantive justice, criminal justice with a substantive outcome for women who have been subjected to gender-based violence is almost unattainable. The challenges are so high. There is the decision of whether or not to report, following the ordeal of an assault, going through that investigative, prosecutorial, adjudicative processes where secondary victimization happens as women are required to go through the minutiae of what happened to them, where they're subject to accusations of making false allegations, where they're just not believed, where there is this kind of culture of disbelief of women, where they're seen as unreliable. So all of those tropes about women you can see come to the fore through the sort of criminal justice process with women who have been subjected to rape. And I thought very early on in my career that substantive justice for women through that route is just not obtainable. Now, and actually, as I've gone on with my career, where a lot of my work has been shifting away, in the early part of the career, I was very much focused on speaking to judges, prosecutors, defence advocates that were talking about their experiences and their relationships to criminal justice. But in the second half of my career, I was much more focused on speaking to victims and really taking into account the importance of their lived experience. And through speaking to women about their ideas of justice, it really opened up an array of diverse experiences, because not everyone is the same, of course. And then there's a lot of feminist literature that I was really inspired by, about these ideas of conceptualizations of justice, these ideas of transformative justice and other things that could take us away or beyond the criminal justice system. So much more recently, in the research that I'm doing at the moment with a wonderful group of colleagues, it's a very large project looking at the way in which the police in England and Wales, all 43 forces, investigate crimes of rape and serious sexual assault. So a lot of the research that I have done over my career has been evaluating law reform efforts, either at the policy level or the legislative level. And one thing that has really become so clear to me is the limits of law reform, particularly in this area. There are a range of different impediments to this. Much law reform has adverse consequences for those that it's trying to protect or serve. It's up against the problems of interpretation and implementation, but it's also up against a number of entrenched norms and ideas about rape and about rape victims. And the rape shield legislation projects, the one that I did with Beverly and Lynn that I referred to earlier, was the first of three. The other two I undertook myself with other groups of colleagues, found that despite the spirit and intention, the well-intentioned, the good intentions of introducing legislation to protect victims in the trial by shielding them from invasive questioning, shielding them from attacks on their credibility, attacks on their character, was not protecting them at all. It was circumvented by the art of the advocate. It was circumvented through just these problems of implementation and interpretation. And there have been lots of really strong feminist work that have highlighted some of the problems with law reform within this kind of context, particularly in relation to gender-based violence. So I became convinced that law reform was never going to be, it had a symbolic value, but it was never going to provide the kind of protection to victims that was required. It was never going to support their justice needs, and it was never going to make them feel safer. So I became much more interested in speaking to victims, to hearing about their lived experience and their ideas about and their conceptualizations of justice. And so there were a series of projects that I was involved in with my colleague Una Brooks-Hay, one of which was just the Justice Journeys project, which involved looking at working with a group of victims who had, from their initial reporting to the police of a rape or serious sexual assault, right the way through to the case outcome and in fact beyond, and their experiences of that process. And it was clear from them that not one of them felt that they had achieved justice in their case. Some of them had, their cases had resulted in a guilty plea and the imposition of a sentence, but they didn't feel that justice was served. And that's because of the way in which they were treated through the criminal justice process, not given a voice, marginalised, their position as witnesses or just a source of testimony. So there are a range of different issues there. And more they were concerned about having that voice, being able for there to be a recognition of the harm that was done with them, rather than winning a case in the conventional substantive criminal justice sense, which was, you know, a real eye-opener to me. I went on to do more projects on that theme, most recently looking at the experiences of those who have had a sentence, a guilty verdict and a sentence in that case, and even more struck by the research findings of that project that, again, you know, winning a case is not the key thing. Now, for some women, you know, going to criminal justice, seeking redress from the law and obtaining a substantive justice outcome is very, very important. But for many it's not. And they have diverse conceptualizations of what is considered to be justice and how they want that to be represented on them.
So you quite rightly emphasise the importance of listening to victims and survivors. And one of the things I've been intrigued with in terms of the research that you've done is the way in which you've imbued it with creative methodologies and actually have stretched our thinking about how you go about doing this very important and difficult and sensitive research. So could you tell us a little bit more about your creative approaches to methodologies?
Yes. Well, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I don't consider myself a very creative person, but I've worked with wonderfully creative colleagues, fantastic creative colleagues, who have brought all sorts of arts-based approaches into the research domain. One of my colleagues was an art therapist in a research project. Some years ago, a large research ESRC project called The View from the Girls, which was a focus on young women and girls involved in gangs. And it was the time when there was a lot of media hype around the problem of girl gangs. And so we embarked on the project with my colleague Susan Batchelor, another graduate from the Scottish government, and Jane Brown. Jane Brown was an art therapist and brought a lot of skills to that work for engaging the women and young girls through arts-based work, and use that as a way for them to tell their stories. Some of them did it through words, some of them did it through drawing, some of them did it through other kinds of creative means. In that project, one of the things that we did was we gave the young women portable cameras, and they went out for a week or two and came back with these cameras, which we then developed the photographs. This was many years ago, and they long before the days of mobile phones and things, and we used those in a kind of participatory dialogue around their experiences of using violence and their experiences of experiencing violence on themselves. And that was my first realization of the power of arts-based as a tool for communication, as a tool for research that offers, you know, a much more freer flowing research encounter than you would have through, for example, you know, a structured interview or a survey or something like that. Now, you know, it comes with all sorts of constraints. You can't do that with large groups of people. But that was my first foray. And in the Justice Journeys research, we did a lot. We worked with a professional photographer and the young women created collages of their life. Some of them wanted to be photographs in particular kinds of ways. Others made things, wrote things, produced objects which was symbolic of what had happened to them and how they tried to deal with that. And these are all have been collated in a kind of exhibition format on the website that we have called Justice Journeys Survivor Stories, and each of the objects that have been photographed professionally come with an account co-written by the women that participated in the research and either myself and Una to explain that. In the most recently, the work that I've conducted in an evaluation along with Lorraine Galesthorpe and Margaret Mallock have been on the evaluation of prisons for women, of the new prison estate for women in Scotland, and we worked with a graphic illustrator there who came in. We spent long periods of observation, overt observation, of with the women throughout their days in the CCUs over a long period of time. And then we introduced this idea of these arts-based workshops, which the women really enjoyed. And that needs to be put in the context of, in these prisons there's a lack of purposeful activities for women. So the idea of an arts-based workshop is a sort of a great relief from the tedium of just waiting in prison. But again, we have produced. It's a way of getting doing a sort of co-producing research findings. So we've produced huge posters that have been produced by the women and by the graphic illustrator, who could work with the women as they were speaking. She was drawing and writing things down as they were speaking. They then added things. They said, no, rub that out, put that in, add a bit more. And we created, over a long process, several months, these posters until the women were very happy with them. And then we created them as some large poster size, and they're hanging in the units themselves now. So I really like that way of working. We've also used photo elicitation workshops in the research that I've done, and just thinking of a wonderful way in which we can engage. It's really important not to impose that on the women. I think that comes out of an initial dialogue around what they would want and what they might be comfortable doing. But having that inbuilt flexibility in those has been important.
Fantastic. When I sort of reflect back on the career, you've done some really wonderful, impactful, really important work and really very difficult topics. So I'm going to ask you now, put you on the spot, what do you think the greatest achievements have been in terms of your research?
In terms of its impact? Yeah.
In terms of anything?
Well, I think there's been probably two projects that have had major impact, really, which I'm very fortunate about, which have been wonderful projects to work on, which have involved wonderful teams of people. And I think that is so important, to be working with people over long periods of time who you respect, whose voice and experience are so important to shaping the project, that you're learning from. So I've been really, really, really fortunate in that regard, in many of the projects that I've worked on. But I guess the rape reform work that I've done was very impactful for highlighting its limitations. It was a very contentious project because of the research findings that emanated from it, because there had been a lot of dedicated work to reform the law in the area, and reform the law of evidence in this area, and introduce this new legislation. But the three projects that we undertook showed that it was just a failure in the way that it was devised. And so that led to all sorts of things. It led to a reformulation, not by itself, but in conjunction with a whole raft, a moving tide of challenge around the definition of rape. And it was one component of that large sort of flow of evidence that came to change the way, the definition of rape and change the law of rape in Scotland. And I feel that that was a really important thing. More recently, the project that I'm involved in at the moment, Operation Soteria, as it's called, is a very big project, and we're now in its 4th year, and it involves all of the forces, all of the 43 forces in England and Wales, and it's an attempt to transform the way in which the police investigate rape and serious sexual offences. And to put that into some context, we've had a long history of criticism of the way that the police approach rape, from the early days of that fly-on-the-wall camera in Thames Valley right back in the 1980s to highlight the problems with police investigation. And this is a big concerted effort to try and involve academics. There's a lot of us. I think there's 18 of us working directly with the police. We've never had anything like that before. It was the brainchild of Betsy Stanko and Catherine Hull, who's here actually, to try this way where academics could work closely with police, with senior police and with on-the-ground cops around transforming hearts and minds in relation to the investigation of rape. And so we have been producing lots of materials and tools and working papers and ways in which police can transform their practice. Last year, all of the police forces in England and Wales launched a national operating model, which is based on all of the Soteria work, all of the products, all of the tools, all of the everything that's in it, all of the memorandum of understanding, everything from the way in which digital material should be used, right the way through to how to engage with victims through a communication plan, have been incorporated in the NOM, and I think that's a major impact story. Yeah. So, but that's again, it's a large team of academics, of which I'm just a small part, and I wasn't in on the Soteria project right at the very beginning. I just came in it after it was running for 2 years. But it's been a transformative piece of research.
It's a real form of feminist praxis, actually.
It is feminist praxis, yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So, just moving away slightly from criminology now, during your career you have taken on a number of other leadership roles within higher education. Yeah. Do you want to reflect a little bit on your leadership journey?
Yes, well, I didn't consider myself much of a leader, but
you've been a director. You've been a director.
I've been, yes. But I think there was an opportunity here that was just something that had to be grasped, I think. And the first opportunity was that there was some money from there was a concern about the capacity of criminology in Scotland. As I said, it was a time when there was funding available to undertake research in Scotland, but a concern about our capacity to do it. And so there was a review by Professor Sir Anthony Bottoms from Cambridge, who came up and undertook a wide-ranging review of criminological capacity in Scotland, and produced a report which led to a very favourable report, but also something that highlighted how this capacity could be supported and grown, and really made a case for the importance of criminological knowledge and research at that time. Thankfully, it fell on very fertile ground, receptive ears, and there was some funding made available from the Scottish Funding Council, which is the body that provides funds to universities in Scotland, and so they put up a fund of money which was competitive, that could, for social scientists to apply for research on public policy matters and public policy concerns. And that's something that we tried to apply for. But at the same time, Tony Bottoms paper came in highlighting the necessity of criminological knowledge, and the Scottish Government came forward and matched the funding that was going to be given to us to set up a research centre on criminology and criminal justice in Scotland. And so there was this opportunity to apply for this funding, which we did, and I'm glad that we were successful. The interesting thing about this, which is it's called the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, SCCJR, was that it was a collaborative effort. It was a collaboration between Scottish universities, which had never been done before. Because before, criminologists had been rattling around in their own institutions, maybe one here or two here or four here. Edinburgh had the greatest critical mass of criminologists. But in Glasgow, there was just two of us who were criminologists and a couple in Stirling. And so there was this fantastic idea that of a collaborative venture between all of these institutions, which are usually in competitions with one another for funding, to come together in a collaborative way, in a deeply feminist way, I have to say, to work together to set up this research centre. So this was the early 2000s. I think this was around about 2003, and eventually the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice was launched in 2006. And so next year is its 20th anniversary, which I'm hugely proud that it's still going. In these much more turbulent times when there's much less funding available from all sorts of different sources. So it's been, SCCJR has been a fantastic success. And myself and from Glasgow University, Professor Richard Sparks from Edinburgh University, and Professor Gil McIver from Stirling University were the original directors of the centre. And I directed the centre for 10 years until 2017 actually, so more than 10 years. And it was a wonderful experience to see the centre grow, to see the kind of capacity building in Scotland of criminological knowledge and skills, the expansion of our PhDs and our postgraduates coming together, and subsequently more universities have joined that partnership. So we have something special and something unique in Scotland, which I know that other jurisdictions are quite envious of, really, and it's something that I'm really, really proud of.
So it should be. Yeah, this is a fantastic achievement. And tell me more about then your leadership journey within Glasgow University, because you also took. No, this is important. I think it's important you took on the role of head of school, as I have done also in my career, and I think there's something about taking responsibility, trying to infuse feminist values into leadership, that when people like you get into those leadership roles, it's really, really positive for an institution. So do you want to reflect a little bit on that?
I don't know, my colleagues would say that, yes. So I became head of the School of Social and Political Sciences, and that was the reason why I stepped away from being the director of SCCJR. I couldn't have done them both together. Both jobs were too huge. So the School of Social and Political Sciences in Glasgow is a very large school. It's got around 300 staff, about 6,000 students. And it's sociology is there, political science, international relations, urban studies. There's a raft of subjects there. And it was a daunting time for me. I was much happier being the director of SCCJR because I knew about criminology and I had wonderful criminological colleagues, and everything that we were doing was in my comfort zone, was in my areas of interest. But when I became head of school, I hit university politics full on, and I hit the demands and concerns of a very large and volatile and vocal
Yes.
body of staff of social scientists who are critical of everything and anyone, rightly so. I mean, and that's what we teach our students, you know, criticality and you know, not being satisfied with common sense explanations and not being fobbed off.
You try law.
Yeah. So it was a huge adventure of trying to manage a school and be a leader within the university. And I think at that level of essentially middle management in the university, or universities try to kid you that you're senior management, but actually you're a middle management as a head of school, even in very large schools like my own, is that you are the kind of squashed meat in the sandwich, because you're having to talk and negotiate and fight for your school in the larger part of the university, in terms of funding, in terms of recognition, and so on, in terms of buildings that we use for our offices and so on. But at the same time, you've got to engage with your staff and be that conduit of information. And actually, there's a protective element for many staff that comes through that role as head of school. So it taught me the importance of communication. You know, really a much more structured way than I'd been used to in the centre. It taught me about how one might most effectively navigate through university processes. It taught me a much wider awareness of the higher education sector in England, in Scotland rather, but in England and Wales as well. But you know, across the whole UK. So that was a great time, and I stepped down from being, well, I came to the end of my term, and I was away, demitted from the role of head of school a mere couple of months before COVID hit.
Right.
So I don't know if that was an easy escape, because of course we had to pivot to a very different way of teaching, and the new head of school that came in after me had a dreadful job right at the very beginning, to sort of come in from a new role from a different institution.
And then the world changed.
And the world changed.
Yeah. Although I think higher education did pull together.
It did.
And I think that was one of the small things that came out of it, that there's learning from about how we pivoted. But anyway, no, it's really important that higher education is led by people like you. So, and it often isn't. So, thank you for doing that role. Other leadership roles you've done, you're talking about government advisory and consultancy roles. You've done lots of that. You've done lots of charitable work. Just reflect on that a little bit.
The charitable work is something that is close to my heart, and I've always considered myself to be both a feminist researcher and a feminist activist as well, right from the days when I worked at Rape Crisis in Cape Town. So I am involved in several charities, and in fact I chair the board of one of the charities, which are all feminist charities premised on a distinctive feminist ethos and set of principles, providing support and advocacy or legal advice in relation to the Scottish Women's Rights Centre, or support to women and their children that are subjected to a range of different forms of violence perpetrated against them. So, and I've been doing that, you know, for forever, really.
Really important.
Yes.
So you are a criminologist in Scotland. Let's just talk a little bit more about criminology as it's practiced in Scotland at the moment. So the capacity building of the SCCJR has been really, really important. I'm thinking more substantively of the kind of research that is conducted. Do you think there's anything distinctively Scottish that is Scottish criminology, or what do you think about the nature of the research and the themes that we're covering within Scotland?
Yes. I mean, I've always thought that there is a distinctiveness around Scottish criminology, and I think that has been consolidated through the development of SCCJR. But in terms of there's a much wider variety of research ongoing in Scotland, and we've really seen that expansion and growth in the last 10 years or so. I think Scotland is a small jurisdiction, but it punches above its weight in criminological terms. It does. It does. You say that too? Yeah. Yeah. I really think it does, because we do have. I mean, we're a small jurisdiction, but we're still faced with all the problems in relation to criminology and criminal justice matters that other much bigger institutions have. But we have that in a smaller jurisdiction. I mean, I think one of the distinctive things about Scottish criminology is the smallness of the lines of communication. So we've already spoken about that you and I and Susan were all part of the criminological research unit in the government. There's quite a revolving door there. There's quite a lot of people that have had that experience in the government. It's not to say that all of the work that's conducted in Scotland is administrative criminology or is funded by the government, on the contrary, but it means that we do know one another, so it means that collaboration is much more possible and much more easily done. And then I think that, you know, Scotland's, as your work has shown, Lesley, I mean, Scotland was premised initially, criminal justice, youth justice in particular, premised on welfarism, but we have seen that change and shift over time to involve much more punitive elements. I think we're seeing a shift again now, not quite back to the days of welfarism, but we're seeing that turn. So that idea of welfarism does underpin quite a lot of the criminological work that is ongoing. In terms of my own area in relation to violence against women and girls, Scotland is seen as quite distinctive internationally. It has a very strong autonomous women's sector that played a very, very important role in the setting up of the new parliament when Scotland underwent devolution from England and Wales, and that has really created the conditions for a lot of feminist criminological work to be undertaken. And there is a lot of connections there between advocacy, activism and academia through that area, certainly in the area that I work in. So I think that those are distinctive elements of it. And of course Scotland's got a distinctive criminal justice system, a different legal system, which I think not a lot of people really fully appreciate. Think it might be the same as England and Wales, and in fact it's quite different. And those differences, like the fact that we have not proven verdicts, for example, like the fact that we have 15-person juries, for example, creates different avenues for different kinds of research and different ways of understanding. So I think in that sense there is a distinctiveness, or as Peter Young has said, a peculiarity of around Scotland for that. For those reasons.
Yes. And what about criminology across Europe then? Because we're at the European Society of Criminology. What about whether criminology across Europe?
I was reflecting yesterday just on the growth and expansion of criminology across Europe. I've been really fortunate to attend every single criminological conference held by the ESC except one when I was at a family wedding and I couldn't make it. And really from those early days in Lausanne, where there were I think there were less than 100 people, I'm not sure, and to now, so we have 2,200 and something people here at this conference. We now have 37 working groups, huge, and we have research and presentations and panels on just about every criminological topic you could think of at the moment. And it's just wonderful to see that growth and that expansion. We also see the growth of the student body as well. And I was really very lucky to attend the ESC summer school earlier this summer to see the students coming around coming together from a range of different countries, from Europe and actually beyond, coming to that summer school. So I think apart from its growth and diversification, the ESC has been an enabler to draw not only academics together but to draw students together. It's allowed for collaborations, it's allowed for international coming together to apply for research funds, for joint writing projects, for a whole range of initiatives that I don't think would have been possible without something called the ESC. So it's, you know, supporting all of these networks and these kind of activities which are proliferating. And I think that we forget that this is our main event of the year, but the conference is not the only thing that happens. All of the working groups have their own meetings, their mini conferences, their symposia, their webinars. So there's a proliferation of activity here. Now, that's not to say that criminology is difficult, is as easy to pursue in every single country. I think different countries have constraints built in about the nature of the work that they can do, about the kinds of research findings that they can disseminate, and you know, there's some suppression on academic freedom in some countries across Europe. And I think, as a society, I think that we are very mindful of that and the way that we can support colleagues in other areas. And I think it's important to register that in some countries, in Europe, as is elsewhere, it's difficult to practice criminology. It's difficult to gain funds to do research, and at the same time it can be very difficult. It can be very difficult to gain access to data. All sorts of constraints there. It can also be very difficult to publish what might be seen as critical or contentious research findings, and I think that we need to be very mindful of that as a society. But I think the society itself can be supportive in that regard as well, supporting colleagues in those kinds of endeavours where the constraints and the pressures on academic freedom are much more intense than in other countries across Europe.
And that's why the ESC is actually a really important.
Absolutely, an absolute enabler, yeah.
And you are the current president, so just as a final question.
I know.
What have you enjoyed most about being president, and what have been the challenges? And you've literally got 30 seconds for this one.
Well, the challenges, it's a huge honour. I mean, it's a huge honour to be nominated and to be elected as the president, and I know that you were one of my nominees, so I'm very grateful to you for doing that. And it's been a blast in so many senses. I mean, it's just been wonderful to be part of this fantastic organisation. To meet other people, to have the opportunity to travel to different countries, to have an involvement in the development of the conferences, to have the pleasure of reading articles and books in relation to the awards, of the book awards, of the article awards, of the early career scholar awards. Fantastic to get that insight into the operation of the society from behind the scenes, but also to see all of the work that's been going on through the society. That's been absolutely great.
Well, thank you so much, Michele, for sharing your life journey, the amazing achievements that you've had. It's been an honour and a privilege to talk to you about your wonderful, distinguished career, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lesley. Thank you for your questions and your prompts. Thank you.